well, fraud and corruption can have dire consequences for any organization. But according to Zaakir Mohamed, who's director in the dispute resolution practice at Cliff Decker Hofmeyr, there are ways for companies to protect themselves. He joins us now. Zaakir, thanks so much for your time. Today, are we seeing a rise in fraud and corruption within companies and organizations?
Yes, definitely. I've certainly seen a rise in a whole host of crimes. Obviously, one of them is cybercrime. There's also been a rise in incidents of fraud and corruption, both in the public and the private sector.
Okay.
We've also seen this play out in what's being reported in the media as well.
All right, you mentioned cybercrime, so I imagine that that's one big one. We'll get to that in a moment. Yes. But what are some of the other key risks that companies are facing? So
there's a whole host of risks. Often when people think of, when organizations look at risks, they obviously look at their competitors, etc. On the cybercrime front, that is an invisible threat because of the veil of anonymity involving cyber criminals. Companies fail to look at the risks internally faced by employees, the risks faced by their business partners and the parties that they engage with, the suppliers that they deal with, the risks that they pose to the organizations as well.
Goodness, so at the procurement level, you might find that there are loopholes there that they need to start plugging. What sort of questions should they be asking?
Definitely, I think there's a lot of loopholes that could arise in the procurement cycle. I think it's important for companies to look at their procurement cycle, understand what their processes are in the procurement cycle so that they can identify the different risk areas. Once they identify the risk areas, they can implement measures to protect and mitigate those risks and ultimately protect the organizations from incidents of fraud and corruption.
How do you do it without getting your employees thinking you don't trust them? You know, there is that kind of balance of not wanting your bosses looking over your shoulder the entire time.
I think at the end of the day, it's about creating an ethical culture within an organization and sending the message across throughout the organization that we're here to protect our business, because this is where we earn our livelihoods from. So in implementing these measures, we're protecting our sources of income and our careers at the end of the day. And I think that's important for employees to understand as well, that these measures are necessary and they are important for organizations to have in place.
And creating a culture of employees actually participating in this as well, around whistleblowing. How much is that being done in organizations?
I think the trend is changing, where there's a greater emphasis being placed on giving whistleblower protection within an organization, creating mechanisms for whistleblowers to come forward. And I think that's particularly important because at the end of the day, senior management, the board of directors, they can't physically see everything that's going on in the organization, so you rely on whistleblowers to come forward and report irregular conduct, etc.
Yeah, and I suppose creating a policy as well. I mean, there are some things that can be, I imagine, a gray area, where a client takes you out for lunch or gives you certain gifts and people don't know what the line is in a particular organization.
Yeah, that's important. I think company policies are quite important. Training employees on the systems as well is quite important. It's not just a case of saying, look, come forward and whistleblow. There should be mechanisms in place on how whistleblowing should come forward. There should be systems and processes in place that deal and guide on how client entertainment should be dealt with, how gifts and expenditure should be dealt with, etc., so that employees understand that the conduct that is expected of them, and they are also then able to make better judgment calls when they're faced with certain situations.
Let's talk about cybercrime. We're seeing lots of reports of that being on the increase, and I suspect that a lot of businesses don't know how to deal with it, particularly things like ransomware.
Yeah, there certainly is a rise in cybercrime, and like I said, you've got a veil of anonymity on that particular crime, so it's sort of a hidden risk, but it's a very live risk that we're seeing a lot of organizations being hit by incidents of cybercrime. Ransomware is certainly on the increase, and I think that's because companies are the custodians of highly sensitive and valuable information, and cybercriminals want access to that information because we live in a day and age where information is incredibly powerful and valuable.
And what about the law in South Africa around cybersecurity, cybercrime? Is that something that's there?
So at the moment, we've got the Electronic and Communications and Transactions Act, which deals with cybercrime, but we've got 3 provisions in this piece of legislation which briefly deal with cybercrime issues. We've got the Cybercrime and Cybersecurities Bill, which is hopefully going to be enacted quite soon. When I say quite soon, it has been a bill now for the last 2 years.
Oh, goodness.
So hopefully within the next year or so, we might see that being passed into law. And I think that's a piece of legislation that's to be welcomed, because it's the first key piece of legislation that will deal with cybercrime together as a whole.
We'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you very much.
Today, that's Zaakir Mohamed, who is Director in the Dispute Resolution Practice at Cliff Decker Hoffman.